everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Legislative Research for History 587 students. So today we'll be looking at citations to legislation, understanding consolidated versus annual laws, looking at how to find a particular piece of legislation, how to discover whether there's a law on a particular topic, learning to trace the history of a law to do point-in-time research, and understanding legislative intent. So first off, we're going to start with a little preview of citations, just to help you identify when you are looking at legislation. Again, you'll likely notice here that abbreviations are very common, which means you'll need to consult the site guide to figure out what some of this means. That being said, there's a general trend that you can see here, especially in these first three citations. You have the title of legislation in italics, followed by an abbreviation that includes the start of a province or territory, a little c, which stands for chapter, and a pinpoint to the section of the law you were interested in. So for the charter example, you might have thought, oh, the charter, that's federal, Canadian, and you could end up searching a federal website forever trying to figure out why the word human doesn't appear in the title. Or maybe you just assume that it's the same charter and you start talking about Section 10, which deals with rights upon arrest or detention. Meanwhile, the author of the article was talking about the right to equality, so you're really confused. In this citation, I can see that the Q in CQLR stands for Quebec. Next, I've added 1457 CCQ. What does CCQ stand for? No idea? If you Google it, the first few results will say the construction code, which is incorrect. The answer, of course, is the Civil Code of Quebec, but this is just another reason why the site guide is important. And last, since this is a history class, and I saw in your materials content dating to pre-Confederation, I figured it was useful to show you this precise rule, which explains how to cite to pre-Confederation statutes. So essentially what's special here is the regnal year, as well as the description of the status of Canada at the time, so here as a united province. This will be really important when it comes to finding the legislation using our main database for this. One quick thing to point out, which I mentioned during the introduction in class, is that most of the time you'll be finding laws as they currently stand, consolidated to include any amendments that have been passed over time. That being said, it may be possible that you need to look up the law as it was introduced, or the law as it looked like at a particular point in time in history. Depending how far back in time you're going, you'll need to look at a consolidation, and then at the annual laws that amend your law to recreate what the law looked like at the time it is discussed in your case, for instance. So I'll show you how to do this later on in this video. But for now, it's important to understand the difference between a consolidated law versus an annual law. So the process of consolidating laws is actually quite tricky, and generally training for this alone lasts about an hour. So I'll just try to show you the basics, and then you can come to me directly as needed for assistance. Finding a particular piece of legislation versus discovering a law on a particular topic. So as you know, for your presentations, you'll need to evaluate not only a case, but also legislation. So to do this, some of you might start from a known law, likely the one cited in your case, and then learn about the social and historical context surrounding its enactment. Others might want to start with a topic that interests you and find a law from that. Both options are valid, so I'll show you how to do both. For finding a law, we'll try searching CanLII and Westlaw next. Know, of course, that you could search Lexis Advanced Quick Law if you wanted instead. Depends on your preference. And I'll also quickly show you the cages hors loi for Quebec legislation. And for starting from a topic, I'll show you how to use Topo from the cage and Halsbury's, which is a legal encyclopedia for Canadian law. And if you were looking at Quebec law, you could use Gilles Cassar instead. Both are available on Lexis Advanced Quick Law. So let's go back to the Morgenthaler case in CanLII. As you can see, often in CanLII, when a piece of legislation is referred to in a case, the legislation is hyperlinked if it is available within that database. So here, for instance, you can see the Medical Services Act is linked, but not the Medical Services Designation Regulation. That being said, if I click on the Medical Services Act, you'll notice that the version I see is current to 2017. Yet, when I look at the versions of this law, I can see that there actually have been no amendments since February 1990. This seems a little odd because non-constitutional laws change quite often, but it will make sense when you read the Morgenthaler decision, something I'll come back to in a minute. Another option, if you knew this was the law you were looking for, is just to search for it by its title from the home page using the second search box, which is the box you use when you are searching for a known document, as opposed to a keyword search in the first box. The last thing to note is that you can also find cases and doctrine from a law. So here you will notice the Cited By tab, which essentially allows you to note up a law to see where it has been cited. Let's do the same thing on Westlaw next quickly so you can see the difference between a paid and free database. The first thing you might note is that the legislation is not linked from the case in Westlaw, so you would need to do a search for the legislation manually in the search bar. Now, Westlaw's prompts don't really work for legislation, so your best bet is to select the Find button and type in your query in the appropriate box. And select the jurisdiction and click on this button. I can see that the Act doesn't appear at the top, which is a little strange because in theory, results appear in order of relevance. But when I finally click on the Act, I can see why. The Act is not in force. Even if it was never officially repealed, it still appears as current. This is something that was not evident in Canley, and if you didn't read Morgenthaler first, you might not have noticed that the court found the law to be unconstitutional, and therefore of no force or effect. So this is a huge benefit of a paid database, which thanks to its annotations, gives you that much more information on the law. Of course, you could still read the entire law in Westlaw if you so wanted. And you are also able to easily cite up the law by selecting the Citing References tab. Another site I wanted to show you was the Loi by the Cage. Now, this is a collection of annotated laws on the website of the Quebec Bar Library. I'm mostly showing this to you for next week's exercise, which will look briefly at the Civil Code of Lower Canada. But it's also great if you decide to focus on Quebec law, and it also links directly to case law and doctrine. Laws are viewable in English and French side by side. Aside from searching from a known law, you might also want to find a law on a particular topic. There really aren't a lot of great tools for this, but there are two that could do the trick. Topo from the Cage, or the Question de Recherche, is essentially an annotated bibliography, which leads you to the best resources to answer a particular research question, including legislation. So let's say you were interested in labor law, and in particular on the right to unionize. You would search in Travail et Emploi, and then either Liberté d'association or syndicat. And you can see this question about the sources to consult on freedom of association in labor law. And sure enough, you have some laws listed here as being particularly relevant, along with other suggested titles. Alternatively, you could use a legal encyclopedia to learn more about a particular area of law. A legal encyclopedia will explain the law in clear terms and link to relevant legislation. This is available on Lexis Advanced Quick Law. And we have one for Canadian law, Halsbury's, and one for Quebec law, Juris Classeur. So I could go into the book on labor here, and either click immediately on the table of statutes, which will list relevant laws in this area of law, or I could search for freedom of association and read more about this right in the context of labor law. And then look to footnotes or even within the main text to see what laws are relevant here. And you'll note that you're also linked to leading case law where relevant. So let's turn to tracing the history of a law. There are two essential tools here: the Table of Public Statutes and Responsible Ministers, which lists amending legislation since 1985 for federal legislation, and Hein Online, which contains annual statutes dating to pre-Confederation times and also contains all the major historical consolidations, which can help you build a law to see what it looked like at a particular point in time. So let's go back to Morgentaler, but this time, instead of looking at the Nova Scotia law that was at issue in this case, we'll look at Section 251 of the Criminal Code, which became Section 287 of the Criminal Code. If you click on the link in the decision, you can see that Section 287 was repealed in 2019. Sometimes the legislature doesn't modify the criminal code even if the court says the provision isn't valid. People just know it isn't valid. So to find Section 287 as it was, you would have to go into Hein Online, select Canada, then Revised Statutes of Canada, the 1985 volumes, and browse for Chapter C46. Then you would have to scroll to try and find Section 287. I happen to know that it's at page 177. And you can actually see at the end of this section that the last time the section was amended was in 1974, 75, 76. So let's go take a look at the 74, 75, 76 amendments to see what was changed. Now, instead of the revised statutes, we're going to have to go into the annual statutes to look for Chapter 93, Section 22.1. An act to amend the criminal code, and a few other laws. So we're looking for Section 22.1, which I happen to know is at page 1879. And you can see in the amendment that nothing really substantive was changed except for the titles of ministers, So effectively, the law in 1970 looks quite similar to the law in 1985. Now, given how the amendment here was really minimal, there won't be any real debate on the issue of abortion in the 1970s. So if you wanted to read more about the legislature's intent when they decided to criminalize abortion, you'll have to go back in time again. So we know from our Morgenthaler citations and from the 1985 consolidation that this provision can be found in the 1970 consolidation at Chapter C34, Section 251. So let's head there. And I know that section 251 is at page 1627. Now if I scroll to the end, I can see amendments in 1968-1969, and that this law was created in 1953-54, Chapter 51. So I could go back to the 1968 amendments, Chapter 38, Section 18, to see what happened there. And to do that, I would go back into my annual statutes, again, an act to amend the criminal code and some other acts. And I'm looking for section 18, which I know is at page 886. Doing this, I find out that the idea of therapeutic abortions was added here as an exception to abortion. And now I can go into the Hansard to find out more about the goal of this exception. So where would you go to find the Hansard? Heading back to our LibGuide, under Canadian law, legislative research, and debates. It looks like Canadian Parliamentary Historical Resources and LIPAD are the ones to use, considering we're looking for debates from the 1960s. Let's search LIPAD today, and you can try Canadian Parliamentary Historical Resources on your own time, because LIPAD gives you a preview of your search term in the results, which is particularly helpful. So let's try this. I'm going to do an advanced search since I know the years that I'm looking for. We'll go to therapeutic abortion. We know the law was passed in the 28th Parliament in June of 1969. That was at the top of the page in the annual statute. And if you Google the parliaments, you'll see that the 28th Parliament ran from 1968 to 1972. So we can search from 1968 to the end of June 1969. And narrow your results in that way. And here you actually have some pretty interesting debates, and some of these comments will really give you a lot to think about. I know that legislative research can be particularly challenging, especially historical legislative research, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.